Do the stones cry out? Or the asphalt upon which our brothers are brutalized? And do the bees buzz with grief? And the trees whisper to each other above ground or beneath? Do buildings worry a bit or rejoice as they crumble? And is the starling chirping good morning to you? I mean directly to you. Does the dandelion mourn or celebrate its seeds as they float away on the breeze? And is the river singing on its long journey to the sea? These may seem like the questions of a poet, a lyricist, a dreamer, but I am coming more and more to believe that they are also the questions of a serious theologian or philosopher in this time of awakening to climate catastrophe and climate hope. In March of 2017, the Whanganui River in New Zealand officially gained legal status as a living entity with the same rights of personhood as a human being, after a long legal effort by the Maori peoples native to the island. They sought to have their worldview honored by law as well as to protect that sacred water. In 2019, the Yurok Tribal Council of the American Pacific Northwest passed a similar resolution, declaring the personhood of the Klamath River. Similar actions have taken place across the world. And when I first read about them, I thought, yeah, stick it to the man. What a great political strategy. Surely if corporations can be people, so can rivers. But I've finally begun to catch on that these actions are far bigger than political strategy. The more I deepen into my spiritual life of oneness with all beings, the more I live out our faith's long-held belief in our very material interdependence with all the world, the more I become convinced that our spiritual wholeness and the well-being of the earth both depend upon us understanding that the earth is not a collection of objects, but a communion of subjects. And the more I read about quantum theory and mycelial networks and geologic time, the more I learn that the stones do cry out as they change, in a voice I cannot hear and on a timeline I am too fleeting to witness. And as Jamila told us this morning, the trees are communicating in ways that I could not have imagined. And the starling is listening to you and trying to talk back. And what is a person but a being that changes and communicates and responds to the other beings around us? And the more that I shed the stark rationalism that upholds colonizer cultures and learn about indigenous wisdoms all across the world, and the more I listen to today's poets and prophets of collective thriving, the more I recognize that, in the words of Gavin Van Horn, no act of honoring aliveness is ever futile or naive. What would it be to live out our lives seriously understanding rivers to be persons? Not as a legal strategy or a naive, embarrassed fantasy, but as a truth. And to consider trees as persons and every single other human as a person finally at last. And animals, of course, and landscapes and habitats. Or if the word persons is too far of a stretch, perhaps you'd like to join with this morning's poet for our reading, Joy Harjo, a Muskogee Creek Nation poet, who reminded us that everything is a poem. Or perhaps you might remember that everything, us and other animals and the planets and the plants not the planets, the plants. Everything on this earth is terrestrial. We are all terrestrials together. And perhaps know that when I say terrestrial, I mean people. What would change if we understood that we are all subjects together? I think the answer is absolutely everything. I think the answer is that we would leave a lot of oil in the ground and raise and hunt and eat food with deep respect and love bodies and free the prisoner and build with the landscape instead of on it and include everyone and everything in our considerations. What would change is our sense of kinship with all creation, a sense of kinship that would insist we treat every person, being, thing, landscaped as sacred. This is a worldview that environmental philosopher John Hausdorfer calls kin-centric ecology, and that indigenous peoples might call life. In a set of volumes called Kinship, Belonging in a World of Relations, Hausdorfer, along with European-American writer Gavin Van Horn and indigenous plant biologist Robin Wall Kimmerer, collects writings of those who share this kin-centric worldview. In the collection, the authors make a strong arguments for humans to engage in a reorienting practice they call kinning. Especially in the West, and especially for those of us inheriting a settler colonial worldview, we have strayed far away from terrestrial kinship. Instead, we live in a dominant culture that lifts up the individual human as the locus of meaning, pinnacle of existence, center of importance, while reducing the rest of the world around us to resources, property, or commodities, which, by the way, makes it easier to reduce other people to resources, property, or commodities. And this is all an expression of the dominant culture's belief in human separability. The idea that we can somehow be isolated from the rest of the web of life, and that indeed that isolation marks our success as humans. But when individual, disentangled humans center themselves separate from the rest of the world, we cast ourselves as dominant and behave accordingly. And my God, how much damage that worldview has caused. Extractive economies, genocides and enslavements and extinctions, daily brutality built deep into our culture and our lives. Separation from the whole breathing earth is the origin story of oppression. Human separation from the whole, interwoven, breathing earth is the origin story of oppression. And kinning is the practice of weaving ourselves back in. It is a worldview shift where humans reconceptualize ourselves as kin with all terrestrials, materially and actively, where we reorient ourselves to ourselves as earth traipsing around for a while before returning to the dirt, as inseparable from the web of life and all other beings, and therefore as sharing personhood with all other beings. Kinning is the process of encountering the personhood of everything. It is our transition from relating to the earth as a collection of objects toward entering a communion of subjects. And kinning is decidedly not the same thing as anthropomorphizing, which centers the human experience and then casts everything else as an approximation of it. Instead, kinning recognizes the subjectivity and therefore the deeply particular and usually mysterious experience of other beings, of every terrestrial. And so kinning is not projection so much as deep and curious attention. Kinning is communion with a world of subjects, and it is the route to the world we dream of, where all can thrive. Because when we treat the world as alive, the whole world comes alive. And when we treat the world and all its subjects as sacred, then we spend our days in love with the world, and more to the point, we spend our days loving the world, caring materially for the thriving of each and all, every person, which means every human, every plant, animal, each stone, river, and more, and all, and everything. Of course, kinship is not a new worldview, but an ancient one, nor is it a disappeared worldview so much as a marginalized one. Most indigenous wisdoms have some concept of beyond human subjecthood. Some indigenous traditions indeed conceive of the whole world as subjects with not an object to be found. And while indigenous wisdom is sufficient unto itself and does not at all need the affirmation of colonizer worldviews to be deeply relevant and whole, I do find it delightful that many contemporary Western scientific discoveries seem to support, if reluctantly, this more animistic worldview. Plant scientists have learned so much about communication strategies and communal activities between trees and mycelial networks and other plants that they have even begun tossing around the idea of vegetal consciousness. Marine biologists have uncovered the rather terrifying brilliance of octopi. And geologists have begun to understand something about the vibrations with which rocks shout and how they change each other's vibrations. And could we think that that is shouting back? The more we understand the processes of the world, the more alive the earth becomes. Or maybe not alive so much as life itself. Perhaps the world is lifing, and humans are simply lifing along with the rest of it. I cannot overemphasize the theological importance of this worldview that denies our separability and remembers our kinship, which is to say that I believe this worldview is salvific, the only thing that can return us to thriving. I was going to say return us to wholeness, but in truth, we've been whole with the earth all along. A kinship worldview reminds us that there is no such thing as nature for humans to return to because we never left. We never could. There is no life outside life, no matter outside matter, no energy devoid of energy. Here on earth, it's all earth. We're earth. We are nature alongside everything else, all family, all persons, all kin. And so perhaps kinning in the end is simply a stance of reverent attention and a return to recognition of what always was and always is, our inseparability with all of the earth. Kinning is the capacity to notice, to rejoice, and to honor every other living thing, which is to say everything. So how do we practice kinning? My guess is that you already are in small ways, talking to your dog and watching his response, respecting the autonomy of your cat who insists upon it, asking your houseplants what they need and watching for their answer. Every day we are kinning already, and every day we can take this practice a little further. Here's an assignment for this week. Go shout with the rocks. Lie against their slow-changing surfaces and listen for the vibrations too deep to hear. Take the bees, your grief and love. Tell them about it. Thank your food for nourishing your body. Promise to return it to the earth. Sing with the river. Whisper to the trees. Really do this. Don't worry if you feel silly. No act of honoring aliveness is ever futile or naive. We can live in a world that is alive. We already do. We can live in deep communion with the whole breathing earth. We already do. we can live in a world that is sparkling with sacredness. We already do.